All right, so good morning, church. All right, so I have been blessed. My name is Jeremy Edsel, the worship director here at the Well United Methodist Church, and I've been given this opportunity to wrap up this series of A Summer's Journey. And it's weird that we're wrapping up this summer journey as we're wrapping up the summer and heading into a brand new school year. That starts in a week from Monday. How crazy is that? I've said it before, this year has just flown by. I feel like yesterday it was January. And here we are, it's already the end of summer. We're powering through into fall, and before we know it, Christmas is going to be here. I've already seen those memes on Facebook that tell us how many weeks are left before Christmas, how many days, and I feel like I'm behind already on shopping, and we'll probably be behind on shopping until that final weekend before, because that's how I roll. It's why I'm never able to get exactly what I'm looking for. You would think I would learn, but no. I wrap myself up in busy weeks. This last week has been just absolutely insane busy-wise. I started setting up machines in the shop over in my day job, and so brain has been firing on all cylinders, and so mentally I'm just like, there's not a lot left. My stepdad found a clutch of turtle eggs in the backfield of their property, and there were like bunches that were already dug up and like torn apart, and so he was like, well, I think Jeremy can save these. So he digs them up, puts them in a bucket, and then whenever I get Ari, after I got off work, all of a sudden I've got a bucket of turtle eggs. And one's already hatching, and now I've got like 6, 7, 8 hatchlings that are out and about, and I'll release them this week, so that was fun. Went and did shopping at Raylana at the mall for back-to-school shopping for Ari, and spent well more than what I should probably say I spent. But hopefully she's good for the next couple months before she grows out of those again, and then I'm broke. And so, yeah, it's crazy that summer and its busyness can it can escape us. And sometimes on our journey with Christ, that can be the same thing. We take things for granted. We miss out on those times to really dig into the Word and dig into prayer. And before we know it, we're exhausted. We've got nothing left. And how in the world are we supposed to change the world when we have no time to do it? I can only imagine what it would be like to be with Paul on his missionary journeys. And especially with who Paul is, he's a gung-ho, I'm going to conquer the world kind of guy. And I'm sure Barnabas was very similar to him. But I can imagine being one of the others and being like, all right, Paul, where are we going this week? Oh, going there? They don't like us there. You do know that, right? They persecute people who go and speak the name of Jesus there. And Paul's like, no, we'll be fine. Don't worry about it. Like Ari says to me all the time, it's fine. And I know full well that it's not fine, and I should probably check what's going on. And then they get there, and they experience these things, and of course, for the most part, it's fine, but there are things that they endure that we'll get into that there's conflict. There's conflict. How would living out the gospel, the way that Paul gave the example of, how would living that gospel challenge systems of oppression and brokenness in our community? That's what we're asking in this final sermon of the series, that summer's journey. So change can be good. I say that while in my head knowing that I hate change. I really do. In fact, whenever Pastor asked me to preach for the first time, which was like basically 3 years ago, if I remember right, exciting, but at the same time change. I've just got comfortable by that time doing the music up here and leading that and knowing that I could hide behind my guitar and hide behind music and be like, all right, here, I'm good now. But change, it's difficult, it's hard, but it can also be good. And sometimes it's absolutely necessary. But at the same time, that change can lead to conflict. And I'm sure we've all had points in our journeys where we've had to make changes that have affected every aspect of our lives. They may be simple changes, like a few years ago for Lent, I gave up a caffeinated soda, and that was an adjustment. I was used to drinking like 4 Dr. Peppers a day and to straight 0, and it's been fun, and now I couldn't go back if things are too sugary now. But we had to make adjustments. Ari can't drink sodas in the house anymore. And that was a bigger adjustment. But some changes, like job changes, Those can be bigger deals. Or a geographical change, like you've moved, or maybe you had just a lifestyle change. And it's rarely easy to make those adjustments and new habits that come along with that change. When it comes to a lifestyle change, especially, it could be even more difficult, and that can lead to resistance from those around us, right? Maybe you became a Christian in a household where Christianity wasn't the norm. How did that affect you? That can sometimes be really difficult, and in some parts of the world, that leads to you being exited from the family in general. Paul and his missionary team, they knew all of that very, very well. Not only did they have to make a ton of adjustments along the way, like where they'd be staying or the people that they'd be encountering and talking to, but they'd face a resistance from a good portion of those that they'd meet. That lifestyle change that they were introducing, presented to them by Jesus, was drastically different than the way the world would naturally have it. Not everyone wanted to hear that, and many would do anything within their power to avoid it at all cost. I mean, think about the people that Jesus encountered, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, where anytime that he'd bring this message of counterculture, of turning the world upside down, what did it eventually lead to? It eventually led to the point where they couldn't have Jesus around being in existence anymore, to the point where they had to put him on the cross just to get rid of him. And obviously that didn't work, which led to Paul's journeys here. So Paul's missionary journeys, they covered 7 chapters in the book of Acts. And throughout these chapters, we see some overlapping themes. Like I talked about, that social disruption, signs of wonders, persecution, and rejection or acceptance, either way, of the gospel message. And on that first missionary journey in Acts 13, Paul and Barnabas quickly established the pattern that they would follow throughout their journey. Going to the synagogue first and telling the Jews that the Christ, our Messiah, Jesus, had come to Israel, and after preaching successfully to the Gentiles, and then afterward, after talking to the Jews, they would preach to the Gentiles. And so by Acts 17, Luke describes Paul as going to the synagogue as his custom, even though Paul considered himself an apostle to the Gentiles. So like in Romans 11:13, it says, I am saying all of this especially to you Gentiles. God has appointed me as apostle to the Gentiles. So while Paul had this on his heart that he was to go and preach to people like us, we being the Gentiles, and I don't know, we might have some Jews in here, and that's great. But Paul's heart was for those who weren't welcomed into the family before. But all the same, Paul still had a heart for the Jews. I mean, him being one of them himself from the beginning, of course, he wants to minister to his family. And so in Romans 9, 1-3, and we talked about this in a couple sermons back from me, it says here in verse 1, with Christ as my witness, I speak with utter truthfulness. My conscience and the Holy Spirit affirm it. My heart is filled with bitter sorrow and unending grief for my people, my Jewish brothers and sisters. I myself would be willing to be cut off forever cursed, cut off from Christ. So it would obviously make sense that he would always seek out his fellow Jewish believers first. Even where there wasn't a synagogue, he would look where the Jews might be gathering together for worship and meet them in that place. So this gospel, this message of Jesus, this message of love, this message of coming glory for the lowly, for the weak, for the brokenhearted, for those who were cast out and forgotten about, this gospel is countercultural. The system that was set up before the Jews were able to take back hold of their temple, it was run by the Greeks. And under the Greek rule, if you know anything about Greek culture and Greek religion, it was do whatever feels good, do whatever feels right, and you're in good shape. That was obviously by far the opposite of what God set forth for the Israelites in the first place, and it was by far the opposite of what Jesus came and taught. And then when the Jews were able to take back their synagogue and kind of had the run of their own community there in Jerusalem under Roman observership, it was going back to the hard rules of the early days of the Leviticus law, where one mistake meant that you were cast out, that you were dirty and unclean, and every year you'd have to come and pay your penance, bring an offering, a sacrifice that would be laid at the altar, blood spilled so that you could be finally clean again. And it was all about the works, all about the actions, all about striving for 100% perfection that was 100% unattainable. So this message that Jesus brought had to be absolutely shocking to those leaders, because it meant that under this new rule, under this new covenant, they would have no power. And that's going to require change. And for any of us who've been in a situation where we have to give up control, that's difficult. Me, in my life, with being a single parent, I have to have control. I have to know what I'm doing at every portion of every single day, and if I don't, I'm lost. And so I strive for that control, and it becomes difficult in my ministerial life to give up that control a lot of the times. And it's work. It takes that effort. I'm still not great at it. I hope to one day be there, where I can just let everything go and, like what people say, let go and let God. But this message, the gospel, caused great social disruption. Throughout Paul's journey, there were instances when society was just turned upside down. And one of these stories comes from Acts chapter 16, verses 16 through 24, and we'll have this up on the screen here. One day, as they were going down to the place of prayer, we met a slave girl who had a spirit that had enabled her to tell the future. She earned a lot of money for her masters by telling fortunes. She followed Paul and the rest of us, shouting, "These men are servants of the Most High God, and they have come to tell you how to be saved." This went on day after day until Paul got so exasperated, in other words, he got really annoyed, that he turned and said to the demon within her, "I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her." And instantly it left her. Her master's hopes of wealth were now shattered, so they grabbed Paul and Silas and dragged them before the authorities at the marketplace. "The whole city is in an uproar because of these Jews," they shouted to the city officials. "They are teaching customs that are illegal for us Romans to practice." Because of that, a mob quickly formed against Paul and Silas, and the city officials ordered them be stripped and beaten with wooden rods. They were severely beaten, and then they were thrown into prison. The jailer was ordered to make sure they didn't escape, so the jailer put them in the inner dungeon and clamped their feet in the stocks. So, I've, in my childhood, at my grandparents' house, my mom wasn't big on the whole corporal punishment thing, but my grandparents, on the other hand, the way that they were raised, they were. And so I remember times that I had gotten in trouble and would have to go and pick out a switch. And I'm sure that rings a bell for some of you out there. And it took a little while for me to realize to not grab the thinnest one that I thought would provide the less pain. But no, that was like wind resistant, and man, it really got some good momentum there. So I could kind of imagine what it would have been like, but not to the extent that Paul and Silas would have felt as they're preaching the message of God, but as a reward for their message, are taken out into the streets, stripped and beaten, probably to the point where they felt like they were going to die, and after, thrown into prison and locked up in shackles. Only because they cast out a demon and stripped the master of said girl of their money and of their wealth. Like I said, with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they lost their power when the community of believers gathered and wanted to take hold of Jesus' message. And the same here, these people, because of Paul's message, because of the gospel, they were going to lose income. Just simply because of that, those changes, they didn't want to meet those changes. In this passage, Paul casts out that evil spirit, the owner's bondage. The owners used her for bondage, for that money, for that divination. And I'm sure it was super easy for them to stir up the city against them. Like they said, they used the ploy of, they are breaking the law, and they are causing us to break the law of the Roman society. So let's tie them up. Let's prison them so that we could go back to the way things were, to the way things are. And a similar instance happened a little bit later in the city of Ephesus, led by Demetrius, a silversmith. So in Acts 19, verse 23 through 41, you could follow me along there as well. About that time, serious trouble developed in Ephesus concerning the way, that movement of Christian believers. It began with Demetrius, a silversmith, who had a large business manufacturing silver shrines of the Greek goddess Artemis. He kept many craftsmen busy. He called them together, along with others employed in similar trades, and addressed them as follows. Gentlemen, you know that our wealth comes from this business. But as you have seen and heard, this man Paul has persuaded many people that handmade gods aren't really gods at all. And he's done this not only here in Ephesus, but throughout the entire province. Of course, I'm not just talking about the loss of public respect for our business. I'm also concerned that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will lose its influence, and that Artemis, this magnificent goddess worshipped throughout the province of Asia and all throughout the world, will be robbed of her great prestige. At this time, their anger boiled, and they began shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesus." Wow, I was getting after Rick last week for Ephesians. Wow, because that's the book of the Bible. Yep. So this is my last Sunday preaching. Thank you very much. Wow. I appreciate that. I won't be forgiving myself for a few days on that one. Anyway, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Soon the whole city was filled with confusion. Everyone rushed to the amphitheater, dragging along Gaius and Aristarchus. I could say that, but not Ephesians, were Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia. Paul wanted to go in too, but the believers wouldn't let him. Some of the officials of the province, friends of Paul, also sent a message to him, begging him not to risk his life by entering the amphitheater. Inside, people were shouting. Some of them, some one thing and some another. Everything was in confusion. In fact, most of them didn't even know what they were there for. The Jews in the crowd pushed Alexander forward and told him to explain the situation. He motioned for silence and tried to speak, but when the crowd realized he was a Jew, they started shouting again and kept it up for about 2 hours. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians! Great is Artemis of the Ephesians! At last, the mayor was able to quiet them down enough to speak. Citizens of Ephesus, he said, everyone knows that Ephesus is the official guardian of the temple of great Artemis, whose image fell down to us from heaven. Since this is an undeniable fact, they should stay calm and not do anything rash. You've brought these men here, but they have stolen nothing from the temple and have not spoken against our goddess. If Demetrius and the craftsmen have a case against them, the courts in this session and the officials can hear this case at once. Let them make formal charges. And if there are complaints about the other matters, they can be settled in the legal assembly. I'm afraid we are in danger of being charged with rioting by the Roman government, since there is no cause for all of this commotion. And if Rome demands an explanation, we won't know what to say. Then he dismissed them, and they dispersed. Paul's teachings against idols in this region was a threat to the business of selling idols in the temple of Artemis. And so Demetrius, he gathered those workmen together in similar trades to create that mob against Paul. And in this instance, didn't actually get Paul. But during the trials, in other places, Paul and his brethren were often arrested. Most oftentimes they were beaten. And he wrote letters of encouragement while he was in prison under these circumstances, such as to the Philippians. In addition to often being arrested, there were times that he was beaten to the point of people thinking that he was dead. But every time he would get up and he would preach the gospel again. He understood that the gospel message is hated by the forces of darkness and that there will be opposition. One of these extreme times came during his first missionary journey. Paul was stoned so severely that afterward the Jews thought that he was dead and dragged his body away. In Acts 14 through 20, it says, "But when the apostle Barnabas and Paul heard what was happening, they tore their clothes in dismay and ran out among the people shouting, 'Friends, why are you doing this? We are merely human beings just like you. We have come to bring you the good news that you should turn from these worthless things, from these idols, and turn to the living God who made the heaven and earth, the sea, and everything in them. In the past, he permitted all of these nations to go their own ways, but he never left them without evidence of himself and of his goodness. For instance, he sends you rain and good crops and gives you good food and joyful hearts. But even when these words, Paul and Barnabas, for the words that they said, could scarcely restrain the people from sacrificing them, then some of the Jews arrived from Antioch and Iconium and won the crowds to their side. And they stoned Paul and dragged him out of town, thinking he was dead. But as the believers gathered around him, he got up, and where did he go? Right back into town. I can't even imagine being with Paul on his journeys in general and encountering the persecution that they faced, the beatings that they would have faced, the torture that they would have faced, the imprisonment, thinking that you were never going to be out and to see your friends and family again. But then be beaten to the point where potentially even being dead, but God raising him up with strength. And at that point, I'm probably out. I'm going to go take a breather, Paul. I'll join you on the next one when you go to Jerusalem next time. They like us a little better there. But no, right back into the battlefield, right back to the ones who had almost put him to death to bring the message of good news. Throughout his journeys, the power of God can be seen through Paul. The impetus of the social disruption in Acts 16 is Paul's casting out a demon from the slave girl. Paul healed a man also in Lystra who could not walk. And in Ephesus, Scripture states that God was doing such extraordinary things through Paul and his friends that if a handkerchief touched them, people would carry it away and use it to heal those who were sick. Reminiscent of what Jesus was able to do, his robe simply brushing by could heal and save. When I think of what we need to do in our missionary journey, and not all of us are called to go into the battlefield like Paul was, but we see things at times. We hear things at times that we have to stand up against and bring that message of good news. Super famous guy in history, William Wilberforce. And I know that rings a bell with some. Got a picture of him up there, a portrait, and he was an illustration of someone who, when applying the principle of the gospel, the good news, he knew that the institution of slavery in the British Empire had to be abolished. He worked tirelessly as a British politician to end the slave trade. Given that the empire covered a quarter of the world's surface at that time, this act of making slavery illegal was tremendous disruption to society. Just like for the Pharisees and those good works of perfection led to salvation, that good news brought a change that was countercultural. So was this. Slavery, they were so dependent on that workforce that it is what built the British Empire. And when it collapsed, you could see the end result of the reduction of their empire, thankfully. And you look at the work that some of our politicians in the 1800s did to relinquish us from from the worst slavery that the world has ever known. And like I said before, we know we're highly unlikely to face the type of opposition that Paul faced, that Wilberforce would have faced on their journeys in spreading the gospel. Or like those that worldwide today, as they are on their missionary journeys, are facing not only persecution, but immediate death if they're found out. We don't have that. Thank God we don't have that here. We've got the freedom to spread the gospel. But that doesn't mean that we won't face obstacles or tough situations. Maybe you have family members that don't know Christ. And maybe that's a struggle. Maybe that's a battlefield that leads to disruption, that leads to hardship, and maybe even a broken relationship. As Christians, as disciples, we are not called to stand on the sidelines and just watch the world go by. We are called to be different. We're called to live differently, to act differently, to love differently. We're supposed to stand up against injustices, to pick up the hurting and the broken, to dispel the rumors of hate and disruption, to tell of the love and the hope that was the message and is the message of Jesus. And through the resistance and through the pushback, we are called to be the change that this world so desperately and wholly needs. And so as we close out this series, I want to leave us with a time of reflection. So we're going to take a moment as the band comes up here and joins me on our final song. We're going to take a moment in silence and in personal prayer so that we can really discern what God has for us today. What message does God have for you? So with heads bowed and eyes closed, I want you to ask God the question of, where do I need to bring your message today? Who do I know that needs to hear your message of love and hope today? So let's take a minute here.